In part 1, I locate the earliest reference to a string band at state prison. The article in question, and the newspaper for that matter, pull a curtain back and offer a glimpse at how life was behind bars a century before my time. These articles are written by prisoners on topics that would only matter to prisoners. The world outside never saw these, never had this glimpse of life behind the walls, and all of this helps me understand the audience and a people I never knew. And as I invest countless summers scanning microfilm, I read about larger-than-life characters that jump off the page. No, this story is bigger than a postcard. For a century, their stories have been stuck on rolled film. For example, let's examine this photo. In the bottom right corner is a guy named W. Campbell. The article describes him as the genial storekeeper and leader of the string band. And while I don't find any other articles about his musical talents, I do have a compelling story worth sharing. And so journey along with me as we unpack Bill Campbell in this episode. Here's an important side note. W. Campbell, or William Walker Campbell, or Bill Campbell are all the same person. Newspapers across the state and the nation will refer to him in an array of formats, but for the narrative here, just remember that. Bill Campbell served 11 months in World War I stationed in the Philippines before he was injured and sent to Otteen Military Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. Following his recovery, he took on the role as the head of orderlies and police at the hospital. Each day, he would check in with different departments. However, he developed a relationship with a switchboard operator named Anna Smathers. The relationship moved quickly, and they soon became engaged after several months of dating. Then, shortly after, Smathers decided she could not marry Campbell. In the week that followed, Campbell approached a fellow officer, and Campbell was visibly upset because he had heard rumors of people knocking him to Anna Smathers. About 2 hours before the tragedy, Campbell said to the officer that he was going to ask Miss Smathers just one more time to marry him, and that if she did not, she would not marry any other. And so on the morning of May 6, 1922, Campbell, Smathers, and another gentleman drove into the town of Fairview, which is just outside of Asheville, to pick up Campbell's car, which had been left there the night before. On the way back, Campbell and Smathers drove together. An argument broke out, and an eyewitness, traveling with his young son and hauling produce on the other side of the road in a wagon, was met by Campbell's car in the wrong lane moving towards him. He saw Smathers jump out of the moving car. She landed on her feet and began running away from the car. The car stopped a few feet ahead, and Campbell got out of the car and began running towards Smathers. He grabbed her by the wrist. An argument happened. She threw her arms in the air and was able to break free. She continued running, this time towards the eyewitness. Campbell caught up with her once more. The eyewitness had this to say.
I don't know whether he had her by the arm or close, but he had caught her just with his hand. While he had hold of her, he fired. She didn't fall. I could see his hand and I saw the smoke, and it seemed to be toward her back. He didn't release her when he fired the second time, and the best I can recall is he held on to her and he shot her again, and she fell.
The witness also testified how Campbell shot 3 times while she lay on the ground. He then returned to his vehicle, loaded his pistol, walked back to the body, and fired twice more. The eyewitness fled the scene and returned with police officers. When he left, the body was lying in the ditch, but when he returned, the body had been dragged to the center of the road. The ditch that Smathers was mortally wounded in was very sandy, and likewise, when they found the body in the center of the road, her face was covered in blood and sand. Her high heels showed signs of being dragged across the pavement, and a blood trail followed from the ditch. And a red hat, which wasn't visible to the witness before, lay beside the body. Campbell flees the scene of the crime and goes to Otteen Hospital, where he stores his pistol in his desk drawer and informs the other officers on base of what happened. He then leaves the hospital and goes to the police office to turn himself in. At this point in my research, I wanted to pause and pull the lens back, because while the court transcripts were excellent at providing eyewitness accounts of this gruesome murder scene, I knew I could gain a much broader sense of the trial from old newspapers. And so I utilized and accessed newspapers.digitalnc.org, which is a wonderful resource full of old newspapers. In the Asheville Citizen, I gather Campbell turns himself in quick, arriving at the police station before a warrant has been issued. The officer at the desk tells Campbell to have a seat and offers the reporter the following quote.
Being previously informed of the shooting, I asked him why he killed that girl. "Is she dead?" he asked me. About this time, Captain Williams came in and said, "That's the man that killed the girl." Campbell pulled back his coat, and I thought he might be reaching for a gun, but he said he did not have any. He looked like a nervous wreck. When I searched him, I thought I could smell whiskey on his breath.
Later that afternoon, Campbell pleaded with the jailer to see the remains of Smathers' body, which happened to be a short distance away at a local funeral home. This privilege was denied by Judge T. Shaw. Campbell was also visited by several police officers from Otine Hospital for whom he was friends with. One of those police officers was named Thomas Parker, and Campbell provided him with his brother's contact information. Campbell's brother arrived on Sunday and had this to say.
On the day after the killing, I came to the jail with Thomas Parker, and it was fully 2 minutes before my brother recognized me. He was tugging away at the bars, and when he did recognize me, he said his mind was blank. He did not know what he had done.
Meanwhile, back at the murder scene, Anna Smathers' body lay across the road. The town coroner and the sheriff arrived at the scene. Eyewitness accounts were taken, and deputies were dispatched to control the crowd. Smathers' body was placed into the back of an open Dodge car, with no sheet to cover her body. It was through a letter from the editor of the Asheville Citizen posted in the newspaper the following day. The letter is calling for the resignation of the sheriff and the coroner, criticizing their poor care for the remains of Anna Smathers. Here's an excerpt from that letter.
The party who conveyed Mrs. Smathers to Asheville made matters worse when they arrived at Biltmore, North Carolina, in that they seemed to cite her body as an object for exhibition.
And in that letter, an eyewitness gave the following testimony.
On May 6, 1922, I was in Biltmore, and Deputy Sheriff Dillingham stopped in front of the building where I was eating my lunch, and he motioned about 2 or 3 times. At last he said, "Come here." I went across the street to him, and he pointed back and said, "Look in the car!" And I saw the body of a dead lady laying crosswise in a Dodge car without any cover over her.
Anna Smathers' funeral was held on Tuesday in Asheville, where friends of the beloved telephone operator left wreaths and flowers that filled Lewis' funeral home. Anna left behind her mother, who lived in New Jersey at the time and was unable to make the funeral, and a young son named after her former husband, Spurgeon. A grand jury indicted Campbell for murder. Upon waiting trial that would begin in July, Campbell began showing signs of becoming a semi-invalid, refusing to speak Smathers' name, becoming very quiet, and laying motionless in a dark corner of his cell. Prior to trial, Judge T. Shaw questioned if Campbell would have a lawyer. Campbell responded, "I have no lawyer and I don't want one." Judge Shaw asked him, "Are you financially able to employ your own attorney?" In a whispered tone, the defendant answered, "I am able to employ my own lawyer, but I do not want to." Eventually, Shaw would overrule this and order an attorney for him. Campbell's trial began Monday, July 24th, 1922, and it took 5 hours to secure a jury. This murder trial became like the summer entertainment for Asheville, as large crowds began to flock into the courtroom. On day one, the prosecution presented their case, that the former chief of police at the Otine Reservation, William Campbell, committed murder with premeditation and malice. By day 2 of the trial, the courtroom had heard the testimony of several eyewitnesses to the murder scene, along with the testimony of several telephone operators who worked with Smathers. The defense began to plead their case for insanity, with Campbell's brother Thomas Campbell and his wife going up on the stand. Thomas gave accounts of his brother entering the Army, a strong man weighing around 190 pounds, and how his illness and stints at several hospitals had left him so nervous that he couldn't hold a cup of coffee without spilling half of it. During this time, Thomas lived with his brother for about a year. He said this,
My brother was subject to insane fits that rendered him unconscious for as long as 2 hours. During these spells, I could see nothing but the whites of his eyes. He would hit his arm, and we would have to place a heavy towel around his arm to prevent him from hitting himself. When he became normal, He seemed to have no recollection of what had happened.
And when Thomas Campbell's wife took the stand, she told a story of her son, who was 6 at the time, being cornered in a room by William Campbell, armed with a stiletto and 2 razors. The last person called to the stand was Dr. Griffin, who was a specialist in mental and nervous diseases. Dr. Griffin was asked for his opinion, and he responded that he thought Campbell was suffering from mental aberrations, which caused his condition to become abnormal at times, during which he believed he was not responsible for his actions. Dr. Griffin was then asked by the prosecution if he believed that Campbell was able to perform rational acts even while he was unsound in the mind. Griffin responded and said he had seen cases like this before, and it was possible. Campbell's behavior in the trial and in the courtroom was interesting. On day 1, he refused to sit with his attorneys or assist them in any matter throughout the trial. Reporters described him as indifferent or a puzzle, staring off into space, tracking people in the courtroom and then dropping his gaze, chewing gum constantly, and fidgeting uncontrollably. Another key moment on Wednesday is when the prosecution spotted the child of Anna Smathers in the courtroom. Apparently, the child had been there throughout the duration of the trial. In a cinematic moment, the lead prosecution attorney, Stiles, picked the child up and walked him casually over to the jury and introduced them, giving the jury an opportunity to cast their eyes onto the child of a mother that had been slain. This led to counsel on both sides disagreeing and arguing about the propriety of bringing a child into the argument, and Mr. Stiles placed the child back on the floor at once, and the matter was dropped. As the third day was wrapping up, it was clear that the defense was proving that Campbell was unsound in the mind. But then there was a sharp turn in the evidence. When the last 2 witnesses, 2 physicians from Otine, took the stand as the state witnesses, Dr. Puritan, Assistant Chief Medical Officer at Otine, and Dr. Rothman, member of the medical staff, testified as to the condition of Campbell when he came to the hospital the second time. They swore the defendant was discharged as cured and that he appeared to be a man of sound mind and was able to tell right from wrong. They also told of Campbell being later engaged as the chief orderly. In fact, they were the only 2 witnesses to be cross-examined at the session on Wednesday. Interestingly enough, through cross-examination, both admitted that they were not specialists in mental health or insanity cases. By Thursday, closing arguments were being made in the trial, and forceful speeches were being delivered from both sides. The jury then took 2 hours to reach a verdict, and the 12-panel jury found William Campbell guilty of murder. Sentencing would be set for Friday at 8:30 in the morning. Outside the courtroom, the prosecuting attorneys welcomed the crowds of people congratulating them. In responding to reporters, the attorneys stated that they were pleased with the outcome of the trial and they felt that justice had been served. Friday morning was met with crowds of people gathered to hear the sentencing. The judge asked Campbell to stand. Judge Lane then asked Campbell if he knew any reason as to why he should not carry out the verdict, and Campbell shook his head no in responding. The judge then issued the sentence of death by electrocution. Campbell's brother files an appeal, pointing out that several people could have prevented this from happening and saw clear signs that Campbell was in fact crazy. However, the state Supreme Court chooses to uphold the verdict of guilty. Campbell is then transported to Raleigh with an execution date set for July. However, the governor delays it until October so he can review the case. And when the warden approaches Campbell to inform him of the delay, Campbell is quoted saying, "Too bad, too bad." The warden is shocked by Campbell's response. In a News and Observer article from July 18th of 1923, I spot the following headline: "Hoping for death, he gets reprieve." A statement from Governor Morrison is provided. In the case, from the information received from the keepers of W. Campbell, I became very doubtful of the sanity of this prisoner, and upon several further evaluations, Governor Morrison decides to commute the sentence to life instead of death. At this stage of my research, I've meticulously combed through Governor Morrison's papers and pored over the docket for Campbell's appeal that was rejected. I unearthed a crucial piece of evidence. However, to maintain the narrative flow, I'll reserve it for the climax of this story. As a side note, I should point out that during Campbell's time in prison, North Carolina had 3 governors. two of them will play a critical role in Campbell's fate. What I'm about to share with you has left me spellbound for over a decade. The next chapter in Campbell's life is extraordinary, and I've carefully laid out all the newspaper clippings about his subsequent journey on a vast whiteboard, extracting what I believe bolsters this narrative. I hope I've done justice to this story that has remained untold for over a century, so here it is. Shortly after Campbell is removed from death row, he discovers a poor, wet kitten in the prison yard one day. He names it Bill and takes care of it, nursing it to maturity. In turn, the cat becomes indebted to Campbell, following him everywhere and performing tricks. However, Campbell is in poor health and battling tuberculosis that he picked up in World War I while he was stationed in the Philippines. He's unable to do heavy work in the prison and barely capable of doing light work. Superintendent Pugh takes pity on Campbell and allows him to establish a prison store where he dispenses soft drinks and little luxuries to the prison inmates. Campbell's store grows into a small grocery in the years that follow. He recognizes the need for help and reaches out to Warden Honeycutt. And Honeycutt has a perfect solution. He offers Campbell the infamous prisoner and North Carolina legend Otto Wood. Otto's fame and status as a North Carolina legend is marked in his ability to break out of state prison. He was an outlaw with one arm. Actually, he had two arms, but he lost his left hand in a railroad accident. And he also had a club foot, which would have made this very challenging to break out of prison, but he did it. A folk song was even written about him called The Ballad of Otto Wood. Okay, back to the story. Otto has just served 2 years and 2 months in solitary confinement for breaking out of the prison for a third time. He is a rather weak and an infirm person, having lost over 50 pounds and unable to do any hard labor. The pair end up working very well together, and Otto swears to the officials and to Campbell that his days of breaking out of prison are over. Campbell and Wood expand on the grocery, adding a delicatessen and calling it Campbell and Wood's Grocery and Delicatessen. Using the store profits, Campbell approaches the warden with a request to utilize the adjacent building for the purpose of building a zoo. Warden Honeycutt agrees, and Bill begins purchasing an array of wild animals and constructing 12-wire cages from scrap metal donated and purchased. Otto Wood helps run the shop and do the things that Campbell can't physically manage around the zoo. The zoo becomes a Raleigh touring attraction and draws crowds from across the state. It becomes a zoo that any city municipal would be proud to own, with an array of animals, to name just a few, including a lemur, a monkey, a fox, a goat, reptiles, and a collection of prized rabbits from Chatham County. Bill orders an aardvark from Laredo, Texas, which at the time are incredibly rare, one of only several in the state. And Colonel Fred Oles, for whose namesake you may have recognized around Raleigh, donates a baby bear cub that he found on US 70 on his way back from the beach. Campbell has hopes of adding additional animals such as lions and tigers to the zoo if he can obtain cages strong enough to hold them. The zoo's story is gaining national attention. I spot articles as far-reaching as Washington State. However, while the zoo is doing well, Campbell's health is declining. And by April of 1930, Campbell was shipped to the state sanatorium and began receiving long-term care for his worsening tuberculosis. Otto was left in charge of running the shop and taking care of the zoo for 3 months. Over the past year, prison officials have been advocating on Campbell's behalf, concerned that he may die in prison before his sentence is carried out. The pardon commissioner discovers matters that were left out of Campbell's trial and opens an investigation. I catch a reference in a News and Observer article alluding to Anna Smathers possibly being unfaithful. The prosecutor who convinced the jury that Campbell should be electrocuted now recommends lenience. Prominent citizens of Buncombe County also began urging Governor Gardner for lenience. Gardner is touched by the sentiments and commutes the life sentence to 20 years, with time earned for good behavior. Meanwhile, back at state prison, Otto receives an honor grade status and is allowed to freely roam the prison grounds. He seizes on this opportunity and escapes for a fourth and final time. This catches an array of people off guard, including the warden and the News and Observer, who just 2 weeks earlier had written an article about Wood and the zoo, with a headline that stated, He won't escape now, with so many friends to leave behind. Now the News and Observer is publishing Wood's mugshot, along with the lament of Wood leaving so many animals orphans. And from the sanatorium, Campbell writes a letter to Warden Honeycutt of his disappointment in Wood's decision. The prison newspaper also chides in with their disapproval and encourages all the other prisoners not to escape. Warden Honeycutt is left undecided on just who would take over the menagerie. Newspapers across the state will spend the fall of this year writing articles chasing Otto Wood's whereabouts. Otto's life will end in a drawn-out gunfight with the police in the town of Salisbury. And so with Otto's passing and Campbell infirm, no one is left to run the zoo. And in the following year, November of 1931, citing need for more space for prisoners, Warden Honeycutt closes down the zoo, and the animals are shipped to new homes. Campbell left the sanatorium and resumed his work at the prison shop. In July of 1932, a woman wrote a letter to Governor Gardner, pleading with him to grant Campbell parole so that she could marry him. On New Year's Eve, just before leaving office, Gardner fulfilled her request and released Campbell. Campbell entered the prison at the age of 40 and left several months shy of 60. Campbell then settled in on a farm in eastern North Carolina where he would spend the remainder of his life. There is no news reporting on Campbell after he leaves the prison, not even an obituary. Unlike Otto Wood, who craved the attention of the newspapers, I'm left to assume that Campbell wanted nothing more than peace and quiet. I discover an application for a military headstone having been filled out by his brother, and I find a photo of the grave located in Maryland, and I learn from Ancestry site that he was married earlier in life before the war, and I find nothing about the prospective marriage outside of prison. Some of you may be thinking, how could a person commit such a gruesome murder and only serve 20 years? I discover an interesting fact located in this book on state prison from Hinkle and Taylor. When the prison opened, all the prisoners wore horizontal stripes. However, by the 1920s and 30s, an honor grade system has been developed. The uniforms the prisoners wore helped the correction officers identify the possible threat of each inmate. Graded C prisoners wore horizontal stripes and were considered incorrigibles with behavioral and disciplinary problems. Grade B prisoners were better and wore vertical stripes, and Grade A prisoners wore denim blue shirts. In 1921, half of the inmate population at state prison were in the C category. In an effort to improve that statistic, Governor Morrison ordered that all prisoners serving definite sentences, those like Campbell, to a quarter of their original length, dependent upon good behavior. This policy continued with subsequent governors, and the percentages of prisoners in the Grade C category quickly dropped from 50 to 20%. We have come to the end of Part 2. I want to thank you as the listener and the viewer. Candidly, I hope this becomes something larger than I created here. And in Part 3, we will talk about the mystery man Paul Turner, a prisoner who captivated so many women throughout North Carolina, but no one knew his identity. No, they didn't make stories about him, but you'll see in Part 3 why they should have, and he'll be another character to emerge from behind these prison walls.